This is Japan, the land of technology, megacities, and all that. Let's take a look at the lay of the land. Japan is entirely an island nation, which means there isn't much usable space, and every patch of it's worth its weight in gold. But have you ever wondered where the biggest cities are located? Me neither. So let's check. Here's Tokyo, and here's Osaka. Notice anything they have in common? Look, both sit on the Pacific coast and are doing just fine. But what about the other side? Oh, that's where the real problem is hiding. Japan's western coastline is downright weird. The country has a lot of people and not much land. And yet, what do we see here? Emptiness. Hardly any giant megacities. Not much dense development either. So what's going on? Logically, it's a long stretch of coastline perfect for a major city, but that never happened because nature said no. Out here, the planet behaves like humans aren't even part of the equation. See for yourself. In winter, whole areas get buried under snow more than dozens of feet deep. In summer, the mountains start moving. Storms and brutal winds charge in from the sea. But wait, we're talking about Japan. Isn't this the country that can build anywhere in any conditions? Well, yes, just not on the west. Today, we'll figure out why there's a coastline where, even with all modern technology, nature keeps repeating the same message. You're not building anything here. If you want to understand the core of this whole issue, let's look at the Alps. Wait, what do Europe's mountains have to do with Japan? The thing is, Japan has its own Alps, right here. And this range is exactly what messes everything up. This mountain chain runs across almost the entire country, like a gigantic wall. These aren't just mountains, it's a hard dividing line that literally splits Japan into two different worlds, east and west. And honestly, the east hit the jackpot. Why? Because on the eastern side, the mountains don't just drop straight into the sea. They slowly fade out, turning into hills and then into plains. And in Japan, plains are insanely valuable. The most famous is the Kanto Plain. And guess what's there? Yep, that's where Tokyo appeared. It's the place where the land stops being basically vertical. Here you can build not only upward with skyscrapers and not only cut into the water on stilts, you can actually spread outward. Roads are a bonus too. They can run straight, rail lines as well. In short, cities can expand without struggling. So what happens out west? Look at this. It's like someone took Japan and just chopped the edge off. In so many places, the mountains end in a sheer drop. And beyond that is the ocean. No broad plains, no extra land to fall back on, nothing convenient. See for yourself. You walk this way, cliff. The other way, water. So how are you supposed to expand a city? It's a fight for every single foot. And even if you imagine the Japanese going, all right, fine, we'll build into the mountains. Another problem pops up right away. Logistics. To connect these areas, you need tunnels and bridges. Not one, not 10, hundreds. Sure, Japan knows how to build that kind of stuff, but in the West, it would turn into a bottomless money pit. Every new city means another tunnel, then another bridge, then another massive mega project. So what do we get? Even at this stage, the geography already looks like a serious obstacle, and the logic is simple. Why struggle and try to develop the West when the East has wide, accessible plains? Sounds fair, but people love making things harder. Nature does too, so it took another pass at the West. And the next hit came from the sky. Japan's west coast is one of the snowiest places on Earth for this latitude. And this isn't the cute, oh, look at the snowflakes kind of snow. In winter, cold air blasts out of Siberia, crosses the Sea of Japan, loads up with moisture, and slams straight into these mountains. Then physics does what it does. The air rises, cools, and dumps everything as snow. And it dumps a lot. I mean, a ridiculous amount. To put numbers on it, look here. This is Niigata City, and it gets about 10 feet of snow a year. And these are the mountain areas, which can get buried under around 33 feet over the same period. So does snow technically stop construction? On paper, no. In real life, absolutely. Who wants to build where the roads have to be cleared nonstop? And then there are roofs that need reinforcing, pipes that freeze and break. Even a normal construction job turns into a drawn-out war with the climate, especially when the East is right there, looking like the obvious winner. So let's see what's going on over there. So the East. The weather here is noticeably milder and more predictable. Winters are shorter, there's far less snow, and in some areas it barely snows at all. Why does it feel so unfair? Let's get back to the mountains. They capture most of the moisture, so very little of it ever makes it to the Pacific side. Perfect conditions for development. But the East has one major drawback that can be a deal breaker. The eastern coastline is basically a magnet for typhoons, tsunamis, and earthquakes. After events like that, the recovery can cost a fortune, billions of yen. So the obvious question is, why keep building up the east at all instead of focusing on the west? Well, the thing is, it's not exactly any calmer over there either. Look at the Sea of Japan. Compared to the Pacific, it's like a bowl, narrow, semi-enclosed, and with tectonic faults running dangerously close to the coastline. What does that mean? Tsunamis that arrive fast. The logic is simple. An earthquake strikes practically right offshore, and the tsunami is generated almost on the coast itself. As a result, people may only have 5 to 10 minutes to save themselves. Almost nothing. For comparison, in that dangerous east, residents typically have 20 to 40 minutes before the first wave arrives. Feel the difference? You should. So in the west, one powerful jolt can translate into almost guaranteed casualties. No early warning, no time for evacuation. And this isn't a theory or a scare story. Nature proved it again not long ago. Let's go to the Noto Peninsula in western Japan. On January 1st, 2024, a magnitude 7.6 earthquake strikes offshore in the Sea of Japan, very close to the coast. A tsunami follows almost immediately. Not expected later, not waves may approach, but within minutes. The outcome is predictable, which makes it even more grim. 500 deaths. And this is Japan, a country that's lived with earthquakes and tsunamis for decades and prepares for them better than almost anyone. It sounds like a paradox, but for tsunamis like this, no one can truly be ready. Everything happens too fast. And the suffering in western Japan doesn't end there. You didn't forget about the mountains, did you? You've got a few more surprises. Remember what I said about the roads out west? They do exist, but they're mountain roads, narrow winding paths where it's really hard to turn around. And what if something goes wrong? A rock slide blocks the route. Well, that's it. The road is basically gone. But wait, what about a tsunami? How are you supposed to get out? Here's the first scenario that comes to mind. People realize a tsunami is coming and try to escape the coastal areas by car. But almost immediately they run into landslides, broken sections, and deep cracks in the roadway. Cars grind to a halt, and that's it. There's nowhere left to go. A natural trap. And what about rescue teams? They won't always be able to help if the road is blocked. That leaves air support. But western Japan says no again. Because even for aircraft, winter weather and rugged terrain can make things extremely difficult, and landing in the middle of widespread destruction is always incredibly dangerous. So here's what it comes down to. Nature on Japan's west coast does everything it can to tell people you really shouldn't live here. But humans are persistent. We'll settle anywhere. Long ago, we came up with something that outweighs every drawback, and that something is trade. If a place offers access to important markets, people will develop it even if it's inconvenient, dangerous, and expensive. Which raises the obvious question, what markets was Western Japan supposed to open up? Let's look at the map. South Korea, North Korea, and Russia are right there. Sounds perfect for trade. But if you set geography aside and look at the real economy, the story gets a lot less exciting. Aside from South Korea, Japan doesn't have particularly deep economic ties with countries to its west. So it's to the east. That's where everything changes. The key factor is the Pacific Ocean. And beyond it are the markets people will endure anything for, from earthquakes to typhoons. Let's name the main trading partners. The United States, the countries of Southeast Asia. Japan's east connects the country to half the planet, while the west stays in the shadows. It's easy to jump to the wrong conclusion that the sparsely populated western side is somehow not important, just background scenery where people live and pay taxes. But no, the West has its own role to play. Now let's head to the Niigata Prefecture. This is one of the rare stretches of the West where the mountains ease off a bit and the land opens up. And what do the Japanese do with that space? They don't build resorts or megacities. They create endless fields. Niigata Prefecture is one of the country's key agricultural regions. They grow rice here. The whole nation eats it, and some of it goes abroad as exports. But wait, if the Sea of Japan coast is buried in snow so often, how did they manage rice farming on such a massive scale? The answer, as usual, is simple. If nature gives you something, you use it. Those heavy snowfalls that look like a punishment in winter turn into the region's main resource once spring arrives. Everything happens in a very simple way. The snow melts slowly, no sudden spike, so it seeps evenly into the ground. It feeds rivers, irrigation canals, and streams, creating a steady reserve of moisture for the entire season. For rice, it's almost the perfect setup. But what about the soil? Surprisingly, the soil is fine. It's heavy and dense, so it holds water extremely well. What would be a drawback for other crops is exactly what rice needs. As a result, the fields don't dry out and farmers don't have to fight constantly for moisture. So yes, we've found at least one upside. Still, that's just 1 point in the West's favor. It feeds the country. Does it have anything else that's vital for Japan? Yes, something huge: energy. And that brings me to another question. We've already seen the lack of space, the high tsunami risk, and the massive snowfall. So how do you build anything here that can reliably generate electricity? The Japanese are again tapping into what nature gives them. All that snow melts, and you get countless rivers rushing down from the mountains. The rugged terrain keeps those rivers narrow and steep, which concentrates the flow into powerful torrents. And that's basically perfect for hydropower. Seriously. Big hydro plants can be found across almost every western prefecture. And in the Hokuriku region, hydropower is practically the primary source of electricity. Altogether, hydro stations in western Japan generate billions of kilowatt hours every year. And that's not even the whole story, because there's more when it comes to energy in western Japan. Next comes nuclear power. Yes, this is where Japan decided to build many of its nuclear plants. But why? Can you imagine a less welcoming place for a nuclear plant? There are two reasons, and both are pretty straightforward. First, it's far from major cities. The logic is simple. If something goes wrong, you don't want a huge population center in the blast radius. Second, it's water. There's a lot of it here. And for nuclear plants, cooling water isn't a nice to have, it's mandatory. And that's where things start getting really interesting. Hydropower plants and nuclear stations in the western part of the country generate staggering amounts of electricity. And yet, the region hardly uses it. Where are the power-hungry major cities? The massive factories? They simply aren't there. So why build so much energy infrastructure here in the first place? The answer is pretty simple. The West powers the East. Take another look at the Kanto Plain. There's basically no space left. Everything is packed with homes, roads, and infrastructure. Finding land for anything truly large-scale is almost impossible. And a nuclear plant inside a major urban area? Seriously. Even if space somehow appeared overnight, who would sign off on that? Especially after the Fukushima incident? That's where the West comes in. It uses its available land to produce energy and then transmits it to the eastern major cities. On paper, it looks like a textbook example of smart land use. But there's a catch, maybe even a problem. Japan designs its nuclear power plants to withstand constant shaking. There's no other way in a country like this. But what happens if a plant is simply too close to one of the major disasters that regularly hit the West Coast? We don't even need to speculate. 2024 already gave the answer. During a 7.6 magnitude earthquake, the Shika nuclear power plant took a hit. It sat not far from the epicenter, and despite all its safeguards, it didn't come through without consequences. Here's what happened. The tremors caused radioactive water to spill from spent fuel pools. The amount was measured in several dozen gallons. Officials later said radiation levels outside the plant stayed within normal limits. The real question is this: how did the Japanese respond to yet another warning sign? For locals, what happened only confirmed their darkest fears. The West Coast is a geographic trap. In a large-scale emergency, the idea that a nuclear plant can be operated safely may look convincing on paper, but in real life, everything plays out very differently. Roads collapse, landslides cut off access, and evacuation plans people love to cite in official guidelines suddenly turn into useless paper. People grasped a simple truth. If the leak had been more serious, they could have ended up pinned between a radioactive exclusion zone and falling cliffs, with no way off the peninsula. That realization quickly spilled into mass protests and lawsuits demanding a permanent ban on restarting the Shika nuclear power plant's reactors. And that leads to the obvious question, is this station really something to worry about? To be completely honest, it was sheer luck that Shika was offline when the earthquake hit, shut down ever since Fukushima, and it's hard to imagine anyone taking the risk of bringing it back. Japanese society remembers all too well how these experiments end, and reopening that debate would be an invitation to major unrest. But people aren't worried only about accidents, they're also anxious about the advanced energy system itself on the West Coast. What kind of problems can there be when the region has both nuclear power plants and hydropower? In fact, there are plenty of those, yet Japan still doesn't have enough energy. That's because the country lives under a very strict constraint. It has almost no domestic resources. It doesn't produce anywhere near enough oil, coal, or natural gas. As a result, over 90% of its fuel has to be shipped in from abroad. And that's a constant vulnerability. Any price spike on global markets and bills go up. A conflict somewhere, a storm somewhere else, a shipment gets cut off, and it immediately shows up in the cost of electricity and heating. People experience that in their daily lives, so the anxiety is real, not theoretical, and the authorities, of course, understand that too, which is why they've come up with a very ambitious plan. Japan has decided to ease off its dependence on imported energy by increasing the share of renewable energy. Solar, wind, and anything else it can squeeze out of nature without relying on tankers or coal ports. The goal sounds great. By 2040, they want to cover a substantial portion of demand with clean power, and by 2050 reach full carbon neutrality. But how do they plan to get there? Well, the country's west coast is ready to lend a hand. Out there, the wind blows almost nonstop, which makes it tempting to install a lot of turbines and generate plenty of electricity. But wait, what about Japan's mountainous terrain? The Japanese have a plan for that too. They want to blanket the coastal waters with offshore wind farms. Over the past few years, the government has already identified several very specific spots on the map, places where the wind doesn't just blow, it works. In these zones, Japanese and international companies are preparing to build large-scale wind farms. For example, off the coast of Aomori Prefecture, there's a project of about 615 megawatts. A bit farther south, near Akita, there's another at roughly 375 megawatts. The paperwork's been approved, the operators have been selected, and the timeline is set. Late 2020s into the early 2030s. Sounds great, except it raises an obvious question. Why only near the shore? Couldn't they go farther out to sea? They can, and Japan knows it. The next step is the so-called floating wind farms, massive structures that aren't driven into the seabed but stay afloat. They can survive typhoons. Strong winds? That's the whole point. Deep water? No problem. For a country surrounded by ocean where shallow coastal areas are a luxury, this is pretty close to a perfect solution. All right, let's say all of this actually gets built. The turbines are spinning and the electricity starts flowing into the national grid. But what about the money? Is there real profit here, or is it just a pretty green narrative? That's where it gets genuinely exciting. Economists have already crunched the numbers. In just one prefecture, Akita, offshore wind farms could generate about $2.4 billion over their lifetime. That's a huge amount of money, and it may not even be the ceiling. Because projects like this aren't only about energy. They also mean construction, ongoing maintenance, logistics, repairs, and that means jobs. Forecasts suggest around 34,000 new jobs could be created, and if local companies and suppliers get actively involved, that number could realistically grow to 52,000. Doesn't it feel like people will soon start moving toward Japan's Sea of Japan coastline? More work, tons of energy? And I found something else too. How do you like the idea that the West could also become an IT region? Let me explain. Right now in Nanto, Toyama Prefecture, a project is underway to build what's set to become Japan's largest data center hub. Its total power draw could reach 3.1 gigawatts. That's not just a national record in its class, it would rank among the largest in the world. The capacity is expected to be enough to attract the biggest players, Amazon, Google, Microsoft, who could train AI systems there. Sounds great, but that's only part of the plan. The project also aims to create a new industrial cluster, bringing in local companies and involve universities and service providers. It means new jobs across a wide range of fields. In short, the West would thrive on every front. But why does Japan's sparsely populated, less developed West need all of this? The answer's simple. The West is supporting the East again. Today, Tokyo and Osaka account for roughly 85% of the country's data centers, and that concentration makes Japan uneasy. One major disaster or a serious disruption could hit both areas and take the whole system down with them. But the West has room. Building a major hub in another part of the country should make Japan's IT infrastructure more resilient. So what's the takeaway? Even if Japan's geography didn't exactly intend for development to spread westward, people are finding a way. We've learned to squeeze the most out of limited space no matter what.